In April 1979, Johnny Green and the Baker finally located a suitable home for the band. It was a rehearsal space called Vanilla. It was a plain, bare room with a tiny stage, upstairs from a car repair garage on Coston Street. It was not far from where the Tate Modern is now. The place would later be called New Sounds. Photos of it are impossible to find. We had to walk in through the cars. It was like one of those factories where you'd go up the stairs and there's a room where the foreman sits. It was great because no one knew we were there. No one came unless they were invited. They'd found the new space, but the band was still down, disengaged with each other and consumed with the general sense of malaise. They adopted the old rehearsal schedule they'd been using for so long. Show up at 1 p.m., work till 10 p.m. every day of the week without exception. They kicked around to football in the afternoons to take a break and blow off steam. Mick was no longer doing cocaine, just smoking weed and drinking tea. All of them were now vegetarians. Everyone had settled into a nice flat or living situation, finally, and the atmosphere of creativity without Bernie hectoring them was refreshing. There was a high level of communication. People were talking about their own lives and circumstances. They were sharing ideas, records, experiences. Paul had learned to play his bass capably by this point. The band members would play with different genres and swap instruments to warm up. Mick and Joe were bringing in song ideas and lyrics. Songs like Lost in the Supermarket, I'm Not Down, Rudy Can't Fail, and Four Horsemen were nearly fully formed before they even came into the rehearsal space. Mick showed up one day and showed them the riff of London Calling. They experimented with different genres, feels, rhythms. Topper Headon's formidable drum skills were key in allowing them to work in different genres and have exciting rhythm and feel changes in the music. Songs were coming together by June of '78. CBS confirmed they were continuing the contract with The Clash. The question was now, who produces the record? Of course, CBS wanted a tested big name, and The Clash owed a chunk of money to CBS after the poor performance of Give 'Em Enough Rope, so they were not in a great bargaining position. Before leaving the band, Bernie Rhodes had suggested Guy Stevens. Joe Strummer had tracked down Guy Stevens, an aging, hard-drinking producer with a vision and manic intensity that had worked with The Clash as well as Mott the Hoople and Procol Harum. Stevens was in a bar, of course. CBS resisted, but The Clash somehow won this argument, and Stevens was enlisted as a producer for London Calling. It's not just another session. I hate people with that attitude. It's electricity. It's gotta be. It may be hard for a company like CBS to accept a concept like this, but I could very well die while making a record. It's that important. Purchasing a cassette recorder and carrying an early demo of the London Calling album, Johnny Green had been drinking. As he was delivering the songs and tape player to Guy Stevens, he left them on the tube. This caused a bit of a freakout. The cassette was only a copy, luckily, and you can hear the best of those demo recordings as a bonus disc called the Vanilla Tapes on the 25th anniversary Clash release of London Calling. July 5th and 6th, The Clash played 2 secret shows to try out the new material. At Notre Dame Hall in Leicester Square, they played for the first time in public I'm Not Down, Death or Glory, London Calling, Rudy Can't Fail, and Hateful. The songs were a revelation to those in attendance, including Jock Scott. He declared it was like the Beatles in terms of the impact and quality of the songs. The band booked Wessex and began recording with Stevens at the helm. The capable Bill Price engineered. The first day, they warmed up with a song from Bob Dylan's soundtrack to Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, and then they played an old favorite, Brand New Cadillac, by Vince Taylor and his Playboys. Paul enjoyed playing bass to that one. When they were done, Guy Stevens yelled, "That's a take." When they said it was just a warm-up, and with the tempo sped up at the end, Stevens just repeated, "That's a take." They were off to the races. Stevens was a maniac, drinking tequila like a madman, climbing ladders in the studio, smashing chairs, hopping around, yelling encouragement to the band as they laid down the first versions of tracks. He was much more about inspiration and less about technical perfection, allowing the band to proceed at a breakneck pace, tackling new ideas with gusto and an edge of wild fun. London Calling was a joy to do because Guy Stevens was a lunatic. I had more control over my instrument by then, and it didn't matter if I made a mistake. Once the first tracks were recorded, one of those would be selected as the best track for the rhythm section. Any mistakes on those tracks would be fixed or overdubbed on another track. Then the new guitars, percussion, piano, horns, and vocals and other instruments would be layered on top. Backup vocals were done in the bathrooms for natural reverb. Samples of seagulls, tearing Velcro off studios' walls, and sex were all integrated into the final product, often very subtly. The energy was electric and inspired Mick and Joe to write even more. Joe wrote the right profile based on a biography of Montgomery Clift that Guy lent him. Spanish bombs mingled a number of historical events into a jaunty political commentary. Wrong'em and Revolution Rock were two covers of reggae songs, of course changed up by The Clash to awesome impact. One day, Paul Simonon came in with a reggae bass line he'd been working on and lyrics to go with it. The Guns of Brixton superimposed the idea of the Harder They Come story into London. Encouraged by his bandmates, Paul would sing it. He labored over getting the bass line perfect. It was Paul's first song. Guy Stevens started showing up less, sometimes disappearing for a few days at a time. When he did show up, he was wasted from tequila and ran out of steam in a few hours. When he dumped a bottle of red wine on a brand new piano, causing 6,500 pounds of damage, it was a major concern for Bill Price and CBS both. The band started telling Guy that they were taking a few days off just to keep him away. Mick moved into the role of producer as things got more technical, having a great partner with engineer Bill Price. It was all a bit sad, as Joe and Mick idolized Guy, and he was a huge part of the record's inspiration and creation. They continued developing the record, recruiting the horn section from Graham Parker and the Rumors. Baker whistled for the intro of Jimmy Jazz. Mickey Gallagher, organist for Ian Drury and the Blockheads, had played with the Animals and Frampton. The experienced player added sophistication and depth to a number of tracks with his Hammond B3. As the London Calling recording sessions neared completion, CBS head Maurice Oberstein came to the studio in his chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce to hear the songs. He was a fan of the band and also had a strained, symbiotic relationship with them. He was a corporate fat cat in some ways and a target of the band's revolutionary politics. Meanwhile, the band made money for CBS, and CBS ultimately paid them. Clash had 18 songs and wanted to do London Calling as an epic 2-album set. This, of course, cost a lot more to produce. Guy Stevens was there and was freaking out about it, yelling and screaming and cursing Oberstein and the Clash. He was grabbing the tails of Oberstein's coat as he tried to leave. He ended up laying on the ground in front of the limo, yelling they would have to kill him to leave. At the end of August 1979, the Clash wrapped up the recording sessions for London Calling. Bill Price and Jeremy Green were left to the mixdowns. Of course, as London Calling entered post-production, the band would have to book a tour. Probably several. They were in desperate need of funds, but there's only one problem. Once again, they had no manager and no one to look after the details. Luckily, band friend Kosmo Vinyl would help them out. Kosmo was manager of Ian Drury and the Blockheads, and he hung out around Vanilla and got to know the Clash. Kosmo introduced the band to Peter Jenner and Andrew King of Blackhill Enterprises. Jenner and King formerly managed Pink Floyd. The Clash hired Blackhill as their first real management company. Taking care of the business end well and efficiently, they had organized itineraries, maps, and checklists for the tour. They kept a good eye on spending, and when they examined the Clash's contract with CBS, they were astonished. The band believed the contract was for 5 albums, but in reality it was for 13. And they were also making a paltry 4% royalties in Europe, when 12 would have been more the standard rate. Indeed, the band made enough to live on, but they were perpetually in debt, and this Bernie Rhodes thing was dragging on endlessly, costing money and tying up a portion of their earnings. So it was good, at least, that they were getting more organized. After a series of random festivals around Europe and some secret shows to try out new songs, the Clash departed for the US. The tour was called the Clash Take the Fifth Tour. The tour logo was a skull with an Uncle Sam hat and a red goatee, and every one of the shows started with the song I'm So Bored with the USA. And yet, the American crowds loved them, even more than the first time they came through. Their charm and wit paired with the undeniable power of the music made them rock and roll darlings in the US. For their own part, the Clash had a great time, delving deeper into the US on their second tour. With 23 show stops, they had a lot more opportunity to see and experience America. Opening for the Clash on this tour were acts like Bo Diddley, who made more than they did, Sam and Dave, Screamin' Jay Hawkins, and the Cramps. The size of their entourage ballooned. Some called this the Girlfriends Tour. In addition, they had the Blockheads entourage members, Kosmo Vinyl, keyboardist Mickey Gallagher, Gallagher's wife and kids. The budget was stretched to the max, and the hard-partying band still wasn't truly cognizant of the financial strain they were under. September 22nd was their second show at New York's Palladium, and it would give birth to one of the most iconic images in rock and roll history. Paul Simonon rarely smashed his guitar, but this night he raised it over his head like a sword about to behead a dragon. A spotlight catches him in punk splendor as a chonky security guard runs across the stage behind him, apparently in pursuit of a female fan. Photographer Penny Smith captured this image at the exact perfect moment. Simmons says the action, smashing his bass, was born of frustration with the venue. We were used to playing with the audience right there in front of you. At the New York Palladium, the audience might as well have been a mile away. You end up feeling as though you're going through the motions. That sparked me up. It was out of frustration that I did it. He wasn't the only one feeling frustration. After an appearance in Canada, Mick Jones pulled the stunt which was typical of his behavior. Just before they got on the bus, Mick refused to board until someone brought him weed. They explained they were about to cross the border where they could get some. Mick refused, sitting in the luggage compartment under the bus in a straw boater and impeccable suit as two fans jetted off to score, returning an hour later with some grass. The band could finally proceed back into America. No one confronted Mick on it, but it had to wear on people when he did stuff like this. When the band headed south into Atlanta, financial disaster hit. They were out of money with no funds to pay the crew and continue. They'd had a series of personal managers. The latest was named Bruce Wayne, and like Batman, he saved them with some much-needed cash. In Texas, they played a few dates, and then an unscheduled show at a tiny bar in Lubbock. Unpromoted and with the minimum of gear, the band turned out what is said to be a legendary performance for a tiny, lucky crowd. After, they visited Buddy Holly's grave, drinking and partying there and leaving some guitar picks on the headstone when they left. On the way back to their friend's house, Topper began turning blue. He was overdosing on heroin. They stopped the car and got out. They began walking him back and forth along the rural Texas road, trying to keep Headon conscious and alive. But it was a wake-up call. Topper had been doing heroin sporadically, but he was also doing a lot of other hard drugs. The expense for all these drugs was another drain on the tour funds. It was a hassle to always score and to worry about crossing international borders. Topper was also a real jerk sometimes, screaming homophobic remarks at a caller on Boston's WBCN, drawing swastikas on Barry Meyer's record box. When sober, he was apologetic, but this sort of behavior just continued. At the end of an exhausting tour, the extra money for operational tour expenses was gone. The last show was in Vancouver, and the crew, finding out they wouldn't be paid, was furious. They refused to plug in the gear. Johnny Green, apparently, took matters into his own hands, taping the roadie's manager to the chair and threatening to brain him with a cymbal stand. The gear was turned on and the show commenced. As the band prepared to return home, Johnny was to rouse them all to make their flights home. Each of the four band members groggily told him to sod off, refused to get up, and announced they were quitting the band. It was October 1979. By November 5th, however, the Clash were back in the studio with Mickey Gallagher back in the desk. They were recording Train in Vain, a song Mick had written. The tune was meant to be released as a flexi disc in NME magazine. The deal fell through though, and Train in Vain was added to the London Calling album. So it ended up being a hidden, unlisted last track on the original release as the artwork was already in production. It would go on to become one of their biggest hits. I'm really proud to have inspired Train in Vain, but often Mick Jones won't admit to it. He used to get the train to my place in Shepherd's Bush and I would not let him in. He was bleeding on the doorstep. It was cruel. The track was like a train rhythm, and there was once again the feeling of being lost. We separated around the time of the recording sessions for London Calling. London Calling was released December 14th, 1979. The band's petition to make it a double album was successful, and the double disc sold briskly at the bargain price of £5. Funk, reggae, soul, jazz, rock and roll. Compelling and creative lyrics and perfect horn parts. The band had embraced a plethora of musical styles and blended them seamlessly into a mature and compelling musical statement. They had come a long way, and the critical response was enthusiastic. London Calling is still considered one of the greatest rock and roll albums of all time. The 16 Tons tour took the band across the UK, an offering to Clash devotees. In Brighton, Pete Townsend of The Who joined them for a few songs, largely miming as he didn't know the chords. Mick was exhausted and threatened to leave the tour at one point, but he was convinced to stay on. As a result of behavior like this, Mick and Joe were often at odds. On January 27, 1980, in Sheffield, the band was backstage preparing to return for an encore of White Riot. Mick Jones suddenly refused to play it. The song was old, outdated, and often inspired crowd violence, and by 1980, Mick Jones hated White Riot. He flatly refused to play it. Joe Strummer, outraged, did not use his words. Instead, the lyricist punched Mick Jones hard right in the mouth. Mick, stunned and bleeding, returned to the stage and they launched into White Riot. Halfway through the song, though, Jones put his guitar down and walked off stage. Joe and Mick would never mention the incident again, but the punch would reverberate through their relationship. Reggae artist Mikey Dread joined the tour as an opening act, turning out lengthy dub sets for impatient Clash fans. When the band entered the studio to record their reggae track, Bankrobber, Dread took control of the session. He taught them how reggae tunes were assembled. Backed with Armageddon Time, the Bankrobber single would debut at number 11 on the UK charts, their biggest hit to date. The CBS execs did not understand the song and they refused to release it in the US. The Clash refused to provide a new alternate single. So much for the creative control they were promised. March 1980 saw the band returning to the US for a short 8-date tour. They were getting big and the promoters were offering them ridiculously luxurious spreads. They were getting complacent, watching TV in their rooms when not on stage. Compulsive risk-taker and chaos creator Johnny Green left the group when Paul Simonon demanded his socks be washed. Kosmo Vinyl was moving into his role, more sober, less chaotic, and more focused on guiding the Clash in their international stardom. In 1980, the Clash returned to Jamaica to record more reggae material. CBS, still at war over the Bankrobber single, refused to underwrite the trip. Paul's girlfriend would cover the expenses with a credit card. The Clash went to Studio One to record, drawing a crowd who wanted to check out this white foreign band who were recording reggae music. Mikey Dread was heading the sessions and also somewhat managing the experience. The Clash's management company Blackhill Enterprises was keen to stay on the standard schedule. One album per year with as much touring as possible between. London Calling was a huge hit, demanding a fourth Clash album to drop before 1980's Christmas shopping season. Mikey Dread was the producer and CBS engineer Bill Price was on the decks. The idea was for a reggae and dub album. They booked time at the Power Station in Midtown Manhattan. Power Station operated 24 hours a day, with artists taking 10-hour slots. The Clash were on the day slot, 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. Chic and Diana Ross were using the studio during the night shift, 10 p.m. to 8 a.m. Once the money for recording ran out, the Clash were forced to find another studio. They ended up again at Jimi Hendrix's Electric Lady studio, with the Rolling Stones recording their disco-flavored Emotional Rescue upstairs. And the band hadn't written any new material for the album yet, just did a few covers at the Power Station. Police on My Back by the Equals, Louie Louie by the Kingsmen. Joe and Mick would write the album in studio, and they brought in Richard Hell's guitarist Ivan Julian to help craft some songs. The Call Up was the first song they turned out. Norman Watt Roy, bass player for Ian Drury and the Blockheads, came up with a funky bass line and helped Joe and Mick conceive of the Magnificent Seven during a rainy day jam session, with each band member joining in and adding different parts. Old friend Hyman Dog was in New York and he bumped into Mick in Greenwich Village. Soon he was at Electric Lady recording his song Lose This Skin with the band. These different influences aside, for the first time, the songs on the album would be credited as being written by The Clash as a group. There weren't many occasions when you'd have the whole band in the studio at the same time. The only person there the whole time was me. A lot of the songs were started as ideas by one or two people on bizarre instruments. Quite a few by Topper, actually. He'd wander over and find a marimba in the corner and play a little something. Joe would breeze in with a bit of paper and say, "I've got a few words to that," and before you knew it, it was a song. Sometimes it would be recorded as a complete song with the whole band, and sometimes we carry on working with original fragments. The whole process was made possible because Topper was such a fabulous musician. Creative juice is still flowing. The Clash returned to Wessex Studios to work on a new album. Bankrobber had already been released in the States, with CBS relenting when they saw the number of imports being snapped up. Despite this success, Mikey Dread was slowly being alienated from the recording process. CBS was pushing for a move away from reggae. Bill Price claims it was never even explained that Mickey was the producer of the project. Friends and collaborators joined for some songs. Paul's bass was getting really good and driving a lot of the work, as was Topper's flawless drumming. But Joe and Mick still had significant tensions between them. Regardless, the band turned out a heap of new material. Somebody's Got Murder was written on request for an Al Pacino movie called Cruisin'. By June, it was clear they had enough for a double album. The Clash wanted to do a 3-disc set, usually considered a grandiose and overblown size for an album. Jenner and King, their management team from Blackwell, strongly advised against it. It was financially suicide to release a 3-disc set at £6 price. CBS would only do a 3-disc set at that price on one condition. The Clash basically had to write off most, if not all, of their UK royalties for the record. The record would also be a much stronger effort at 2 discs. There was a hell of a lot of filler. The band pushed forward, and it was basically the death knell of their relationship with Blackhill. Jenner and King still contend that CBS manipulated the situation to get rid of Blackhill, and CBS had everything to gain getting rid of them. Don Letts did a music video for The Call Up, which would be their first single. The band donned military garb and costumes for the shoot, and immediately after were whisked off to shoot the album cover with Penny Smith, still wearing their helmets and goggles. On December 12, 1980, Sandinista was released in the UK just in time for Christmas. The sprawling record was 90 minutes longer than their first album. With a huge range of styles and approaches, it can be hard to digest. Kosmo Vinyl hand-delivered the promo copy to NME to ensure it was reviewed before the holidays. The magazine slammed the record, calling it tepid and demoralized. Other publications also gave it poor reviews, and the album and its single both tanked. The 3-disc approach proved to be a failure. It also provoked some bitterness and lawsuits, as Mickey Gallagher, Dredd, and Norman Watt Roy were not credited on the songs they helped write. Blackhill and the Clash parted ways, with Blackhill claiming to have never been paid a cent for their work with the Clash. They had no contract, and the band had been in debt the entire time. The company eventually folded, at least partly due to the loss of income related to the Clash. They had, however, formed that publishing company, which gave the band control of their compositions. This was a huge step. Only Pink Floyd had done the same. So in 1981, the Clash were effectively broke again. They had no real money to speak of, no management company. A bloated clunker of a record, Sandinista, was being panned. Paradoxically, they were now of mainstream popularity and considered one of the favorite bands of British youth at the time. Topper Headon was doing more and more coke and heroin at the time too, and it made him less reliable generally, but his drumming was remarkably still on point. Topper's musicality somehow remained intact through it all. In January of 1981, Joe Strummer was walking through Notting Hill when he ran into none other than their estranged ex-manager, Bernie Rhodes. Rhodes told him his trilby hat made him look like a wanker, and told him everything the Clash was doing was wrong in characteristically acerbic and colorful language. By February, Rhodes was reinstated as manager. Mick remembered when Bernie tried to force him out of the band, and he was vehemently against it. Paul and Joe were craving some of the anti-establishment direction Bernie had provided earlier in the band's career. Joe Strummer even threatened to leave the Clash if Bernie Rhodes didn't come back on as manager. Though Sandinista sold a little bit better in the U.S., Epic Records' planned 60-show tour was canceled. Bernie had a better idea, though. He'd set up 2 week-long residencies in New York, London, and Paris. Kosmo, Vinyl, and Bernie were at odds at first, but Kosmo grew to admire his vision, if not the execution. Bernie brought them back to Vanilla and reinstated Johnny Green and Baker. Johnny was not impressed. I survived 1 day with them. It just smelt bad. I sat around the rehearsal room. I knew what bad days were, when not a lot is going on. It was like that. It just seemed like they drifted even further apart than when I'd gone to Texas. Bernie looked like a small, shriveled figure compared to before. While England in 1981 was being torn apart by riots in Brixton and other political chaos, Mick Jones was getting into rap music in the US. His inspiration would lead to the April 1981 recording of Radio Clash, one of the band's most forward-looking dance numbers. At the end of the month, the Clash embarked on a month-long European tour. Mick was still acting like a prima donna, demanding egg and chips before he would play. At the end of the tour, the Clash flew to New York for their first 2-week residency as conceived by Bernie. These shows at Bonds Casino would be considered by some to be the Clash's finest hour. Rick Rubin claims the shows turned the Beastie Boys onto hip-hop, which seems like a bit of a stretch, but the Clash definitely drew a line between punk and rap music. Mick's remix of the Magnificent Seven was called The Magnificent Dance and was getting play on black station WBLS. The Clash were chuffed, and the opening act for the first show was Sugarhill Gang. Mickey Dredd and Lee Scratch Perry did dub sets. The Bonds Residency would re-energize the band to get back in the studio and create their first and only US Top 10 record, an album that would give rise to 2 giant international hit songs and cement the Clash firmly as one of the great rock and roll bands of an era. In the fall of 1981, The Clash got to work on their 5th album. They moved their gear into the historic People's Hall, which was home to Ear Studios. It was remote and industrial, just like Vanilla and Rehearsal had been. Mick was being difficult again. His guitar tech quit, and he insisted on replacing him with a female tech. When he couldn't find one willing to take the job, long-haired man Digby Cleaver took the job. And Mick hated long hair, and so at the advice of Topper, Digby cut it to smooth out his relationship with Mick. Mick was talented enough to get away with acting this way, for now. The Clash immediately dug in and began working on Ghetto Defendant, Overpowered by Funk, and Inoculated City. Bernie was involved in the work, hanging around as usual, making wisecracks, snide judgments and suggestions. The band was alternately kidding around like old friends, or tense and sullen. Topper was getting ill more and more often, to the point of vomiting on the floor right before a German TV interview started. The drugs were taking a toll. Between recording, The Clash did a run of shows around Europe. On the Radio Clash tour, during their final 6-show run at London's Lyceum, Mick was wearing a necklace his girlfriend Ellen had given him, a silver bullet on a chain. As Mick was dancing and playing by the edge of the stage, the necklace flew off into the crowd, which made Mick go apoplectic. Jones tried to start a fistfight with Joe Strummer off stage, and then Topper started making fun of him, and Mick stood on the drum riser screaming, "You don't care!" at Topper, while Topper threw drumsticks at him. They soon relocated to Electric Lady in New York once again. Jeremy Green was engineering, Mick Jones was producing. It was a lot like the setup for Sandinista, which must have provided some level of comfort. As did the presence of an old friend, Mickey Foote, who from the very first album to this one accompanied friend Timon Dog to the sessions. Timon remembers Joe coming up with the lyrics for Rock the Casbah right before the music was written, chanting "Rock the Casbah and let those ragas drop" lyric to poke fun at Bernie Rhodes. Meanwhile, Topper was hammering out a song on the piano by himself. He had lyrics too. Joe threw away Topper's lyrics and replaced them with Rock the Casbah, and that's how Topper Headon wrote a large part of one of the Clash's greatest hits. In Car Jamming, Inoculated City, and Straight to Hell, Joe's leftist politics are loud, clear, and bold. Sean Flynn is an ode to Errol Flynn's son, who died in action as a war photographer. As the band attempted to wrap up the record, Topper Headon was nabbed bringing heroin into England. This was tragic. Combat Rock still wasn't even completed. The Far East tour would be coming soon. Japan, New Zealand, Australia, Hong Kong, and Thailand. The lawyers argued on the band and Topper's behalf, and they got him out on bail provided he get help for his drug issues. Topper was admitted to the Priory in Roehampton, a drug rehabilitation facility that had helped out Brian Jones in the past. But Topper's girlfriend smuggled drugs into him. Topper claimed to be road ready, and so the group embarked on the 6-week Far East tour. The record was not taking shape, and the band and the label both were not satisfied. CBS brought in Glyn Johns to edit and remix the album. Johns rearranged the songs as one disc LP, and Joe Strummer re-recorded vocals for a few songs. In April of 1982, they released the first single from that record, Know Your Rights. There were 2 mixes of Combat Rock, longer, dancier versions and shorter versions. The entire band, except for Mick Jones, liked the shorter ones. Joe disliked the mixes generally. No one was really happy. Glyn Johns was recruited by because Bernie took over mixing when Joe and Mick went on tour. He mixed down the final version of Combat Rock in his garden in Warndon, West Sussex. Johns had mixed the Beatles, the Stones, and the Who. He impassively assessed the record and mixed it. Some of his adjustments caused considerable tension in the Clash camp. Joe went into hiding. Joe Strummer's absence meant a string of canceled shows. Bernie Rhodes and Kosmo Vinyl were scrambling to try and get shows going. On May 18th, Joe returned to London, and it was revealed that the whole fiasco was Bernie's idea. They did a gig for cash. They really needed it. It was at the Lockham, and it would go down in band history as the final show with Topper on drums. Topper was doing so many drugs he was zoned out and barely communicating with the band. When he grabbed the mirror Joe Strummer was using to comb his hair, it was the final straw. After due consideration, the Clash fired Topper Headon. The one-disc record turned out to be the Clash's most commercially successful, with 2 massive radio hits, Should I Stay or Should I Go and Rock the Casbah, both back-to-back on side 1. They both blew the single Know Your Rights out of the water. Should I Stay or Should I Go reached number 17 in the UK and number 45 on the US Billboard Hot 100 chart, while Topper's Rock the Casbah peaked at number 17 in the UK and number 8 on the US Billboard Hot 100. The album itself reached number 2 in the UK and number 7 in the US, making it the most successful Clash album to date. It was a commercial and critical success, and the Clash's last great record. McCartney's Tug of War was the only thing that kept them from going to number 1 in the UK. After Combat Rock was released, the Clash basically imploded. Bernie Rhodes had negotiated a new contract for the band, but both Mick and Paul refused to sign it. Due to Jones's constantly missing rehearsals and his increasing use of synthesizers, tension continued to mount between the band's two primary songwriters. A few weeks into rehearsals, Joe Strummer and Paul Simonon fired Mick Jones. Mick began a lawsuit attempting to prevent the band from recording under the name The Clash. The only remaining members of the band were Joe Strummer and Paul Simonon, and I guess Bernie Rhodes. Time passed, and for a while it seemed The Clash were done. And then, in September of 1985, This Is England was released. It was a single from the band's sixth and final studio album, Cut the Crap. For the recording sessions, Headon and Mick Jones had been replaced by relative unknowns. The band had placed anonymous ads in Melody Maker and had auditioned more than 100 players. Pete Howard took over on beats, and the formidable Mick Jones was replaced by two guitarists, Nick Shepard and Vince White. The Cut the Crap recording sessions took place in January and February of '85 at Weirton Studios. They were marked by tension and conflict as Bernie Rhodes and Joe Strummer battled over the direction of the band. In the absence of Mick, songwriting had become more difficult. Rhodes confidently attempted to take control of the band's musical direction. Most of the songs were co-written by Strummer and Rhodes, with drum machines and sampling taking center stage, despite Strummer's vision that it would be a return to punk. Rhodes produced and arranged much of the material, despite his lack of experience with production or songwriting, and it shows. He gave hell to the new drummer, constantly deriding him and at one point storming into the studio to smash up the drum kit. Credited on the sleeve under the pseudonym Jose Unidos, Rhodes was avoiding any hint of the Clash's past. He thought he was inventing a new genre, combining hip-hop, punk, electronic music, and found sound cut-ups. The album seemed like a sad attempt to appear modern and relevant. Pete Howard's drums were completely replaced by programmed beats, and the guitar work of White and Shepard is almost completely absent from the final album. A move like this can destroy the image of a band. Cut the Crap has been called one of the most disastrous albums ever released by a major artist. Strummer disowned the record and dissolved the Clash 2 weeks after the album was released. Most Clash collections and box sets ignore the record and completely exclude it as if it never happened. As they should. It's really not representative of the band's output. Strummer played one song from the album once in his solo career. In short, it was a horrible record, and it spelled the final death knell for the Clash. And one could say that Bernie Rhodes, instrumental at the start of the band, was also a huge influence on the death of the only band that mattered. Hey, if you dug this video, check out this one about the Cramps, it's pretty cool, and this other one which YouTube's friendly team of robots selected based upon your viewing choices, so it's custom designed for you, viewer.